So we're going to kick off this CERTL experience today by talking about the concepts of backward design, learning objectives, and learning taxonomies. And as I said before, my name's Erin Hager. I support our professional development and education component of our Faculty Center for Teaching and Learning. And again, just welcome, welcome, welcome. We are so glad you're here. And since we're a small group, Allison, would you mind just taking a minute to tell us what program you're in?
Yeah, sure. I'm in the molecular medicine PhD program.
Okay, great. And are you working with students right now, undergrad or serving
No,
as
not
a
right
TA,
now.
something like that? Okay,
No.
great. Aman, how about you?
I'm in intercampus UMB/UMBC gerontology doctoral program in epidemiology track. Regarding like my teaching experience, I'm just a research assistant here, but in my previous university, I did a lot of TA.
Wonderful. That's great.
Yeah.
We're so glad you're here. Erica? She may not be here. Condra, we're just doing real quick introductions. If you'd like to tell us what program you're a part of. Oh, we can see you unmuted. I just can't hear you. No. Okay, must be having some technical difficulties. Well, again, welcome.
And
And we're
Erica
really
said her microphone's not working.
Oh, gotcha. Okay. Thank you. All right. So I'd like to start us off today just by asking you to think back to your undergraduate experience back in those undergrad days, however long ago those might have been. And I'm wondering if you can remember a time where you might have looked like my friend here, where you were feeling a little bit overwhelmed, a little bit confused, not because the skills of the course were challenging, but more because you didn't know what was expected. You didn't know what the professor was going to be asking of you later. You didn't know how you were going to be using the information that you were given. Did anybody ever have an experience like that in their undergrad days? You might like to share.
Yeah,
Yeah,
my
mine.
undergrad, yeah, my undergrad in Nepal was like back in my country. I did my undergrad in Nepal in statistics, in physics, mathematics, and statistics. So it was horrible. Like there were like 400 students in a class, and just one like instructor who is only available during the class. So it was
Yeah.
kind of like uh troublesome something. But the masters, definitely the masters in Nepal was far better.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that may have a lot to do with the size of the class. That can certainly, make us feel a little bit isolated and wondering how we fit into this big community. But sometimes that this feeling emerges when we're receiving a lot of information. A lot of information is coming at us very quickly, and we just don't know how to categorize it, organize it in our brains because we're not clear on the expectations of how we are going to be demonstrating that knowledge back to the professor, right? So if you have ever been in a class where you or a fellow student asks, is this going to be on the test? Right? That is one of the key questions if you want to say what drives a faculty member crazy, right? They'll often say that question. And it could be heard as the students really don't want to think on their own. They just want to be given the test questions, right? But when I hear that question, I am hearing a plea for some kind of structure or some kind of sense to know how am I expected to use all this information, right? When you think about a chemistry class, right? I know that in biology 101, students are going to learn about how a cell functions. I also know that students who are learning to become oncologists are learning how a cell functions. And those are two widely different looks at a cell because the level of learner is so different, right? So we need to find some way to communicate to our learners at this point in their journey, what are they expected to do with the information that you're providing? And that is why we come back to this idea of learning objectives. Right. So to prevent the overwhelm and let students know exactly what are we expecting of them. So to show our learning outcomes for today, what will we be able to do? So I hope by the end of this hour, each of you will be able to explain how a learner benefits from those clearly written learning outcomes or learning objectives. I hope you're able to define the term backward design and describe how it relates to this idea of learning outcomes. And then I hope you're able to describe how to write learning objectives or learning outcomes using what we're going to call this ABCD method, which we're going to talk about later on, and connect that to what we call a learning taxonomy. And then we're going to talk about some common pitfalls that can happen when we're writing learning objectives. Any questions about where we're headed in this hour? We good? Okay. So what are we talking about when we talk about learning objectives? These are statements that describe behaviors, skills, or attitudes that we want students to develop through these learning interactions, right? So we typically see them phrased this way, just like I showed you with what we're doing today. By the end of the session, participants will be able to create measurable learning objectives using this particular method, right? So they're statements written from the learner's point of view, describing what they will be able to do as a result of this instructional time, whether that's one class period, whether that's a unit that covers maybe 3 or 4 class periods, or whether we're zooming out to the course level, right? So within this defined period of time, what should they be able to do? What kind of skills can they demonstrate? Or how might they have a change in their attitudes based on what they are learning and experiencing? So in our reflection, to kick this off, we talked a little bit about the reason why these can be so important, right? That feeling of, I just don't know how I'm going to have to show this, show my knowledge, show what I've learned, right? And so learning objectives are important because they help the faculty member communicate those expectations to learners, right? They recognize the level of the learner and they say, I know that you are not going to need to understand everything about a cell the way an oncologist does, but by the end of Biology 101, this is what I'm hoping you'll be able to do. By the end of this 90-minute class session, this is what I hope you're able to do. They also provide you as future faculty members some guidelines for instruction, right? Once you know what those outcomes are, it becomes much easier to limit the scope and the focus of what you're trying to do. And I really emphasize this to folks who are in your position as graduate students and postdoctoral scholars, because you are right now immersed in a depth of expertise in your topic and your discipline that is so deep. And it can be very hard as a new faculty member to come from the graduate student or the postdoc environment where you are not only a scholar and have this depth of knowledge, but you also know everything that isn't known, right? About what you're studying. How many papers end with, more research needs to be done, more of this, we need to learn more, like you are just immersed in the scope and scale of your field of expertise. But then you're asked very quickly to pivot because now you've got college freshmen, now you've got college sophomores in this class, in this Biology 101 class, and it is beyond the scope of their ability at that point in their career to understand the depth of the topic that you are now familiar with, right? And also it can feel almost like a disservice to those students to only narrow it down to what they are able to process, what those course level outcomes and what those learning objectives can say, right? Because there is so much more to know. But when it can also be overwhelming and create that sense of, that first slide where the student just seemed so out of her depth, right? When we frame things within the boundaries of learning objectives, it helps our students know, like, this is where we are right now. This is the moment in time. And that's also really good knowledge for you, particularly as a young faculty member who's making that transition. The other important thing about learning objectives is they help us design our assessments. When we know what the finish line is, we can appropriately craft our test questions. We can appropriately craft our assignments to make sure that we're measuring what we said we would measure, right? Making sure that instrument does what we want it to do. And then lastly, it's really important because so many schools, every school has some level of accreditation that they're responsible for, right? And so often these clear learning outcomes and learning objectives help programs apply with accreditation requirements. So we're going to talk about that just for a second. We're not going to go too far into the depth, but when we talk about this concept of backward design, what we're really exploring is the idea that as faculty members, even though you are in charge of the course that you're teaching, those objectives in that course does not exist in a vacuum. And so I like to think of this visual. Is anyone familiar with those Russian nesting dolls where the little tiny doll fits into the next size, fits into the next size? There's a picture of one, right? So when we're thinking about an entire curriculum, I like to think about it like these nesting dolls. And so your unit that you're teaching, the objectives that you're writing for that particular week of content is the smallest level there, but it doesn't exist on its own, right? It exists within the universe of the course, right? And the course has a direction that it's taking. The course has outcomes that by the end of the course, every student should be able to do these particular things. But the course also does not exist in a vacuum, right? The course is part of a program, right? The course is part of a major. The course is part of a bigger unit within the institution. And that program has outcomes that it needs to demonstrate, that all biology majors will be able to do these things after graduating from the University of Tennessee's biology program, right? And then that operates within the realm of accreditation. So the entire institution is governed by these accreditation standards. And so at every level, we are trying to demonstrate that the students are able to accomplish these things. And so sometimes as a faculty member, either as an adjunct or perhaps as a new faculty member in a program, you might be given a syllabus to work with, right? And you have some flexibility to change a few things within that syllabus, but you might not be able to revamp it completely because that syllabus has been designed, those course level outcomes have been designed with all of these higher level requirements in mind. So when you're given a syllabus, and if you have questions about what you might like to change, it's really important to talk to your program directors and talk to your administrators about what kind of leeway you have so that you are not inadvertently making a change that suddenly puts the program at risk for not meeting particular standards, right? So just to say that while you have flexibility in how you're teaching something, sometimes based on the curricular requirements, you may not have the ability to say, take out an entire unit of content, right? So when in doubt, it's always important to ask. And it's also just important to know that while you may not be responsible for designing, right, these program level outcomes and higher, right, that the program is accountable for that. And so your course and that particular unit you might be invited to come in and lecture on does exist within that universe. Are there any questions about that? No? Okay. Real quick, I just want to show you an example from a physician assistant program about how this works. So at the biggest level, we have what's called a competency, right? And this is what a practicing physician assistant should be able to do. They should be able to discern among acute, chronic, and emergent disease states. That's what an actual PA that you go in to see at the clinic should be able to do per the governing body of the physician assistants. That translates into a standard. This is the accrediting body for all PA education programs in the country. They say if you are going to operate as a PA education program, your curriculum must provide da-da-da. And you can see how that ties back to what a practitioner needs to do. So then University of Maryland, Baltimore, they are a PA program. They want to be in compliance with these standards and that competency. So they have a program level outcome that is pretty wordy, but you can see that it reflects backwards the standard and the competency. So all of these things are fitting together. So then we get to the course level. The course is emergency medicine, right? Filling in those higher level competencies and standards, but now we're getting more specific. Students are going to be given a case presentation. They're going to demonstrate how to evaluate, prioritize, and manage these patients, right? Then we're going to get into, within this course, a unit on cardiovascular emergencies, right? Getting a little more specific. And then finally, the test question, our assessment, is going to measure, were we able to describe the evaluation, management, and risk stratification of a patient with chest pain. So going from the micro level all the way up to what a practitioner needs, right? That's what we mean when we say the phrase backward design. So when we're thinking about in this particular unit, what we need to do, we just know that it exists in a universe that's bigger than that particular moment in time. Are there any questions about that? Okay. So when we get to the nitty gritty of writing effective learning outcomes, learning objectives for a particular unit, here are a few things to keep in mind. One is that effective learning objectives focus on student behavior. What will you be able to see the student doing as a result of this instruction? Okay. We'll talk more about that when we start crafting them. They are clear and measurable, right? We want to make sure that we use verbs that we know that we can design assessments around. So we want to avoid phrases like students will be able to understand. Well, how can I see someone understanding? Well, it depends on what the objective is. Do I want to see them comparing and contrasting? Do I want to see them evaluating something? Do I want to see them pointing at something on a diagram or a map? What does it mean in this instance to understand it? We want our objectives to focus on learning that results from an activity rather than the activity itself. So for example, we want to avoid writing learning objectives that say, students will answer questions 3 through 6 in the workbook, right? That's a task. That's a homework assignment, right? But what are they going to be able to demonstrate by doing that? That's what we want our objectives to say. And then again, to that point we just discussed, we want to make sure that they align with program or institutional goals. So I'm going to show you two faculty members' clipboards here right before they walk into class. And I want you to look at these lesson plans and tell me what you notice in the difference between them. So both are going to look at the topic of plagiarism, right? So section 1 by Professor Smith, I'm going to give you a little bit of time to read that. That's their list. And then Professor Jones has a different list. So I'll give you just a minute, and then I'd like you to just let me know what you see, what comes up for you when you look at these differences. Feel free to unmute and just call out what you notice.
Hi, so this is Condra. I think my mic wasn't working earlier, but the for Professor Smith, that list is more helpful for saying like what they plan to do, right? Whereas I think for Professor Jones, the focus is on what the students should be able to do by the end of the class or the unit. So they're the different focuses.
Yeah. Yes, Condra, that's exactly right, right? One is very student-centered, section 2, right? The other one kind of reads like a little, it looks like my lesson plans when I first started teaching section 1, right? It was all about like what I was going to walk into that room and do. It's not to say those things aren't important, right? I need to know what my sequence of activities are. But that said, it doesn't give the students any information about my expectations about what I'm doing. Yeah, exactly right. Allison, I saw you unmiked as well. Did you have something to add?
The second one is a lot more specific as well.
Mhm.
It's like a lot more detailed.
Yep. Yep, that's exactly right. Yeah, Aman.
Yeah, I think the first one is more like about talking about input to the students or something, and second one is like kind of like output, like what the students will finally know.
Yes. Yes, I like that phrasing, input versus output, right? This is what I'll be showing them. This is what I'm going to be giving them to use as the raw material so that they can do what we see here on the second clipboard. Let me ask you this. If it were time for me to craft my assessment at the end of the unit, which one would make my life easier when I'm thinking about how to test these students, how to assess what they've learned?
The second one.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly right. And the great thing about going through this process, it can be time consuming and a heavy lift at the beginning. But once you have these clearly written, measurable learning objectives, the rest of your tasks as an instructor become a lot easier, right? For here, the assessment almost writes itself because of the way that I have structured these learning objectives, right? So instead of going back to the first clipboard and trying to think, all right, what did I do? What's a fair assessment? How can I make sure? These really point me exactly in the direction I need to go to make sure that the students have all crossed those finish lines. Any questions about that? All right. So let's get into that, the nitty gritty of actually crafting these statements. You've seen enough of them by now to probably get a sense of where we're going. But when we talk about this ABCD method, the A stands for audience, right? Who are we talking about, right? Most of the time we're talking about students or learners. You know, sometimes that is just absorbed within the objective itself, and it's pretty obvious who we're talking about. But we can also get more specific, right? First year biology students will be able to, right? Then we're going to use the B to describe the behavior, right? What will students be doing, or what kinds of change in attitude might they have based on what they're learning? The condition is how, and there isn't always a condition attached to a learning objectives, but that might just tell us a little bit more about the context, right? So let's say in a physician assistant program, you know, sometimes students are practicing skills with a peer before they're actually seeing patients, right? So you might describe the context, right? So working with a partner, students will be able to ask the basic questions of a health inventory, right? Or you might want to clarify, you know, working with a live patient or a simulated, what do you call it, a standardized patient. Students will be able to do these things. So you might sometimes want to clarify in what context or under what conditions these will happen. And the degree is how much. So sometimes, you know, students only need to get 70% correct in order to pass. So if there's any kind of condition around how much or the degree to which they need to show that, then you might want to put that in the objectives as well. C and D are not always in learning objectives. A and B always are. So let's look at some examples here. Right, so here we have our audience, students, the behavior, identify, right, all the bones in the hand. And then the condition is on an x-ray, right, as opposed to looking at someone's hand or looking at a picture of a hand, right? A diagram is very different than an x-ray. So we're getting some clarity around the condition that they're performing this task in. And the degree could be with no errors or at 85% accuracy, or it could be, you know, within a certain amount of time, right? Again, those are not necessarily written in every objective, but I wanted to give you one that had those. Are there any questions about these? Does that make it clear kind of what each of those components means? Okay. So let's look at this objective and we'll kind of figure out where the A, B, C, and D are. Right, so the objective here is accurately interpret summary statistics, and then they give some examples of what that is for a given data sample. So who's our audience here?
I think it says. It doesn't seem to specify who the audience is.
Yeah, so who can we assume, right? This could be implicit or explicit. So
But just the students of the class.
Students, learners, right? Right. It's not always explicitly stated, but that's who we're assuming. What's the behavior? What are they going to be doing?
Interpreting summary statistics.
Exactly right. Interpreting summary statistics. And what's the condition here? What parameters are we putting around this learning objective?
They'll be
Looks like
given the
it's just-
data.
That they're given the data. Exactly right. So instead of saying, you know, grab an article or, you know, find your own data set, we know that we're going to contain that a bit by giving them a data sample, right? And so they're all going to be interpreting from the same set. right? Later on in the course, right, as you're building, maybe you want them to find their own data set or to look at a data set of an existing paper, something like that. But here we're saying, nope, we're just going to practice with what we have. And then the degree. Is there any word in there that clues us to the degree?
Accurately.
Accurately. Yep. That's exactly right. Great work. So often when I'm working with faculty in creating new courses or thinking about their new curriculum, and they get to the point they know that they need to craft these learning objectives, but sometimes it can take a little bit of effort to figure out, well, what exactly am I looking for? And at what level am I really hoping students are going to be able to work with this information? What am I really trying to get them to? What finish line am I trying to get them to cross? And when we're feeling a little bit lost, it can be very helpful to tap back into a learning taxonomy. And here we've got, you may have heard already of this Bloom's taxonomy. So this comes from an educational psychologist in the 1950s or so. It's been since revised. But basically, when you see this pyramid here, I like to think of it as an intellectual food chain, right? So we're kind of starting with these baseline tasks here that are clustered under this remembering category. And when we're in this phase, you can think of a student being very new to vocabulary, very new to concepts, very new to terminology, right? And so at this level, we might be having students memorize or define terms. We might be asking them to list or to point to something on a map or on an x-ray, right? Where it says this very introductory level of getting exposed to this material. And then as we move up this food chain, we kind of get up into this understanding level. And now maybe the students are taking this information and they're starting to put it in their own words, right? They're describing it back to you. They're explaining it to a peer. They're restating or summarizing. So they're still in that early level of familiarity with the concepts, but we're not quite at that baseline, right? And then we move up. We're going to take this information. We're going to put that knowledge into use into new contexts, right? We're going to apply it. Maybe now I know where all the bones in the hand are. Now I'm going to look at an x-ray and see if I can find the bone that's broken, right? I'm going to take everything that I've learned and I'm going to look at a case study and see how that knowledge might impact or be applied to that case study. And then we kind of move up a little bit more. We're going to analyze. We're thinking about differences between things, how things fit into a larger whole, right? We're categorized. And then maybe we're going to make some decisions from that information. Maybe we're going to evaluate. We've learned a lot of terminology about public policy. We've looked at different case studies. We've applied what we're learning. And now maybe we're going to look at two policies that are trying to impact X outcome, and we're going to see which one we think has the better chance of succeeding, right? So you can see that all of these things sort of assume an understanding and an ability to do those tasks underneath it, but we're moving up in terms of what we're asking the students to do. And then finally here at the topmost level is creating something new, right? Draft a policy that you think would be an effective agent of change on a particular, to reduce health disparities in certain zip codes, that kind of thing. So they're really needing to absorb everything that they've learned in order to create something new from that. Any questions about that? I think the key takeaway here is that when you're thinking about crafting your learning objectives, it's really important to think about where are the students in their journey with this information, right? And where are you trying to get them? Right, so that you can help them along the way. So if they can't do these basic things, if they don't know the terminology, is it fair to ask them, to use that terminology to evaluate something or to create something new? So there's a mindfulness that needs to happen. Also, an awareness of where your course is in the curriculum, because it could be that in a prior course, students got this baseline understanding, right? That they should be familiar with these terms by the time they get to you, so that you can take them from that point into some of these higher level thinking skills, right? So not everything happens within the context of one course, but it may be happening across the curriculum. So this Bloom's taxonomy is one way to get ideas to think about, okay, what verbs do I want for my learning objective based on where the students are and where I want them to go. The other nice thing about using a taxonomy like Bloom's, and I think we could see that in that clipboard activity, is that when we're clear about the verb, the assessment is a lot easier to conceptualize. So if we're at that remembering level there at the bottom, and we want them to identify certain terms, right, or certain things, then the assessment might be as simple as a multiple choice quiz, asking them about definitions. It might be a matching activity, things like that, right? But if we get up to the understanding or explaining, well, maybe we want them to write a paragraph. Maybe we want them to participate in a discussion to show their ability to explain. And then when we get into applying the information, well, maybe we want them to do a task, right? Maybe we want them to do some kind of worksheet or to answer some questions about a case study, that kind of thing. And it just keeps moving up. So the type of assessment that you're going to design is heavily informed by the verb that you choose for your learning objective. Any questions or thoughts about that? I wonder if anyone's had the experience of preparing for a particular assessment where you think you're going to be assessed at a particular level, but then you get to the assessment and it is either much more advanced than what you were expecting, or you were preparing for something very complex and actually presented with something more on this remembering or understanding. Has anyone ever felt that disconnect when they've been given an assessment? No? You guys had very well prepared undergraduate faculty, which is great. I can tell you in my experience working with online courses, this is one of the things that students are most frequently, most likely to bring up on something like an end of course evaluation. If they feel that the level of assessment wasn't aligned with what that objective was, if they felt that either the test was more complex than what the objective indicated or vice versa, then they're very quick to point out that discrepancy, right? Because it can feel a little bit like a bait and switch. So it's really important to keep that alignment in mind as you are working through your curriculum. Now, Bloom's is not the only taxonomy in town. There is another very important way to frame how we are thinking about the finish line for our students. And this is DEE, Fink's Taxonomy of Significant Learning. I put in the chat a document, but if folks came in after, they may not see it. So let me put it in there again. Just take a second to do that. Here we go. So we're not going to get into this in too much detail, but I did want you to have it as an alternative. Just another way to think about where we want students to end up. And this one has a much more kind of student-centered humanistic approach to thinking about what we want students to be able to do with that information. All right. So there's some common pitfalls that we can experience, we can fall into as we're drafting learning objectives for the first time. And I just wanted to take a minute and see, based on these, if you could describe in your own words what you think the pitfall might be. So I've got some sample objectives up here written in orange. We're going to go through a few examples. What do you think might be a pitfall reflected in this one?
That's a pretty complicated,
Mm-hmm.
it's like a lot packed into one objective.
That is exactly right. It is a lot packed into one objective, right? We've got a lot of different battles. We've got a lot of different things that we're analyzing here. Exactly right. And I just lost all of your faces and names. Was that Khandra?
Yes.
Okay, if I if I can't see you, I lost my people faces here, so we'll get those back. But that's exactly right. So we want to make sure that with each objective, we're really narrowing in on one idea, right? So, and maybe we can consolidate this. Maybe we could say after completing the lesson, students will be able to analyze the political and social impacts of multiple battles of the American Revolution, right? So we can kind of consolidate it. But doing political, social, economic, right? That might be okay at the course level, but for a particular unit, that might be a little too big. Right? So we can write multiple ones or we can find ways to narrow it down. All right, let's look at this next one here. So here we go. Yep, too complex or wordy, multiple outcomes in one statement. Let's look at this one. Students will appreciate the importance of communication in a team environment.
That is super vague.
Super big. Yep.
Or vague, I'm sorry.
Oh, vague. Yes. Yes, exactly right. Where do you think the vagueness comes from?
I mean, there's no details about like how will they appreciate it. Doesn't say how
Uh-huh.
you're gonna like evaluate that. Communication is like, I mean, that encompasses like, I mean, are we talking about written communication, verbal communication, like, and then team environment, like what kind of team environment? There are a lot of options there too.
Exactly right. Exactly right. What does it mean to appreciate? Right? What does that mean? They'll be able to describe it back to you? Are they going to be able to show how to communicate in a team environment, either through written language or, doing an email or a Slack chat or whatever? Yeah, what exactly does that mean? Right? It's very vague. Yep. Not specific enough or measurable, right? And we want to make sure we avoid verbs like appreciate, know, understand, and learn, right? Because those are not telling us exactly how we're gonna measure it and what we're gonna see. What do you think about this one? What pitfall might this be describing? Using sample data, demonstrate to students how to calculate standard deviation.
This one is focused on the instructor.
Uh-huh, exactly right. Right? How could we change it so that it's more student focused?
Say the students should be able to calculate the standard deviation of a given data set.
Mm-hmm. Exactly right. That's right. Words are in there. It's just the focus, right? Who we're talking about. Really good job. Very good. You guys are pros. All right, I think we've got one more here. Complete the interactive online lesson about preventing infectious disease in a managed care setting. What pitfall do we notice here?
This one is also just like a homework assignment rather than like showing like what they will learn about preventing infectious disease.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly right. Focused on content or activities rather than the behavior itself, right? So the interactive online lesson is the vehicle through which they're going to practice these skills or learn these skills, right? But that's not what we're measuring. That's just did they do it or not, right? But what are they going to be able to do as a result of having this content? Are they going to be able to create an infectious disease management program for a clinic, right? At that very high level tip of the pyramid? Or are they just going to be able to identify 3 strategies that are known to prevent infectious disease in a managed care setting, right? Those are both important behaviors, right? But we just don't know the range of what students will be able to do after going through this lesson, right? Really well done. Really well done. So what I'm hoping that we get from this, like, is our learning objective going to take every college student from that frustrated, confused student we saw at the beginning to this, very thrilled student we're looking at here. The learning is still difficult, right? There's still challenges and there are going to be bumps along the road in terms of their mastery of the content. But whatever we can do to lessen the guessing game for the students, right? Have them focus on learning the material instead of figuring out what we want as faculty members. That is really the point of crafting these learning statements so that everybody is on the same page about where we're going. And then we can focus all of our energy on the tools and activities and events that need to happen in order to get us all there, right? So focusing the attention on practicing and learning what will actually be measured instead of trying to figure out what am I supposed to do with all of this.